Well, good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. And I apologize for us getting started 15 minutes late tonight, and that's all on me. I got caught up in something else that I probably shouldn't have been playing with, and next thing I know, I don't have time to get this set up in time. So, what happened, happened. Now, before I go into other things, I did want to say a word or two about the music in case you picked some of it up, because there were a couple of pieces there that are kind of unique and unusual. And by the way, if you are wanting to follow along with the music we are playing through the church hymnal, copyright 1941, I think by the General Conference Corporation of Seventh Day Adventists, which at the time was, I think even then they were in Silver Spring, but they were in a different location then. At any rate, I started tonight at number 5. We ended at number 15. And the second and third hymns that I played are essentially unique to Adventism. Now, the first one is for an obvious reason. The words of "O Worship the Lord" were written by J.S.B. Monsell. And if I recall correctly, he was an Anglican bishop who also served as a poet and wrote hymn hymn lyrics. And this is one of them. And there are other tunes to set these words. But the particular tune that you heard tonight is titled Southampton and was written by one Edwin Barnes in 1886. Now, if you don't know who Edwin Barnes is, he was a British musician and organist who came to the United States at the invitation of John Harvey Kellogg, and amongst other activities served as organist for the Brattle Creek congregation of Seventh-day Adventists. And it was in that role, apparently, that he wrote this music for the words of J.S.B. Monsell. And you probably won't find that music anywhere but in an Adventist hymnal. Now, the next one, number 7, "The Lord in Zion Reigneth," does not have an Adventist author, and it is not music by an Adventist composer. The words are by Fanny Crosby. And that sets it apart to some extent because, for the most part, Fanny Crosby did not write praise hymn lyrics. Most of her lyrics were more experiential and gospel style lyrics. The music was one by H.P. Danks, a musician who had credits both as a secular and sacred composer. But what makes this a uniquely Adventist hymn is that for some reason, and I haven't figured out what it was yet, this mix of words and melody was copyright again in 1886 by the J.E. White Publishing Company. J.E. White was the son of James and Ellen White, amongst the founders of the Adventist Church. Like I say, how he ended up with the copyright on this, I don't know, but apparently it's kind of marked the song as uniquely Adventist, and it rarely appears other than in Adventist hymnals. So there you have that. Been kind of a busy week here. We're still working on getting quotes for fixing our roof. The odd thing was, I got up this morning, looked out the window, and I could see that it was raining. And my first thought was, well, of course. Now, why would I say that? Well, because I finally got off my duff and went out and washed the car yesterday. What happens after you wash the car? Yeah, it rains. So, yeah, okay. Anyway, got that done. Got a few other tasks complete this week. I won't go into all of them, but that's just kind of the week it's been. And I've had to make several trips to do additional things, and we got those done and taken care of. So we're here this evening and ready to continue in our read through of the book of Proverbs. Now, unless I'm mistaken, we're ready to begin with chapter 15. That's what I put in our title here. And when I read the first verse of chapter 15, I said, that is a familiar proverb, and I'm positive we haven't read that one yet in this group. So that's where we're going to start this evening. And since it's taking us a bit of time to get through Proverbs, rather than going on with more yammering, let's go ahead and bow our heads and get started. Our Father in heaven, we thank you that we have had another week to live and to share with you and with those around us. And as we have seen the world around us, we are increasingly dismayed by the mess that's out there. It makes us long for a day when this world is restored to the design you had for it when you initially created it. We want to be part of that. We want to be part of bringing that day about by submitting to the work of your Spirit to transform us into the image necessary for that to take place. As we open the written word this evening, we are thankful that there are people who had experiences with you, their Creator, and were willing to write down what they gathered and learned during those encounters. So as we open the word this evening, we ask that the Holy Spirit will draw close so that each person might receive a correct impression of what he's read and the blessing that is right for them at this time. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So, see if I can find where my cursor is so I can click on that, and you can read along with us out of Proverbs chapter 15, which begins, "A gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare." It almost makes me think of the line out of the play A Man for All Seasons, which includes a character known as the common man, who appears in multiple situations as a commoner in Old England. So he's the ferry boat person. He's these different things, and each different role he has a different hat. When it comes time for the trial, then all the hats are placed on sticks to form a 12-person jury, while the actor playing the common man wears the 12th one and gets the speaking parts assigned to the jury in the play. At the end of the play, he comes out and he says something along the lines of, "I'm still breathing. Are you still breathing? It's not hard to stay alive. Just don't make trouble. Or if you must make trouble, make the sort of trouble that's expected." And then he says, "Oh, well, you didn't need me to tell you that." Now, why did I think of that? Because as I read verse 1 of chapter 15, I think we didn't need Proverbs to tell us that a gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare. That sounds pretty obvious. Now, going back to our view of this as sayings that Solomon wrote down in support of decisions he made in cases brought to him, what kind of a case might have led him to make this statement. Did he perhaps have a situation where neighbors ultimately came to blows over an argument that they got into that kept escalating because rather than giving gentle answers, each party was using harsh words and they tended to fire each other up until the situation got out of hand. Earlier today, I watched a video out of Georgia where police got called to a scene on account of a shooting. And they got there and there was a man on the ground and there was a woman standing over him. She was the one who had called them, and eventually they learned that she had apparently unintentionally fired a .45 and it went clear through this man, through his lung, into his backpack and through several books in his backpack before lodging in something that was in the backpack before it actually came out the back of the backpack. So they did find the bullet inside that backpack. But the woman told police that she only wanted to scare him, and she was living in a house. He didn't live there, though he was her baby daddy. They'd had a tiff the night before, and the guy this woman lived with had told her that her boyfriend, her baby daddy, was not allowed on the property. He didn't belong there. So she was trying to get him to leave, and she thought she'd pick up one of this guy's guns and scare the guy away. Not being aware, so she said, that the guy kept all his guns loaded with a bullet chambered. So she's standing there holding the gun and it goes off. She didn't even think she'd pull the trigger. Again, what she told the officers. So they went to work on the guy. They got him to the hospital, but he didn't make it. And so now this poor girl has to live with knowing that she killed somebody. And maybe she'll learn a little bit about gun safety and why it's not wise to have loaded weapons all ready to go in the house because of things that can happen when you don't intend them to. And again, this is another situation where harsh words made tempers flare. Reading on. The tongue of the wise makes knowledge appealing, but the mouth of a fool belches out foolishness. I wonder if this was an assessment of testimony that Solomon heard when a case was brought to him. The Lord is watching everywhere, keeping his eye on both the evil and the good. I like this one because it shows God acting impartially. He keeps his eye on both the evil and the good. He knows what everybody's doing. He's watching everywhere. It doesn't matter whether you're evil or good. God's eye is on you. Gentle words are a tree of life. A deceitful tongue crushes the spirit. And there are people who will lie with the specific purpose of harming others, of making them feel bad, of putting them in their place. So they crush the spirit not just because they're careless with their words, but because they intend to do so. Gentle words, however, are a tree of life. Only a fool despises a parent's discipline. Whoever learns from correction is wise. And I'm going to bet you footnote A says that the Hebrew just says fathers. Let's see what it says. Yes, that's exactly what I thought. Okay.
to explain the difference between discipline and punishment.
Well, I think we've
And
already discussed that here, but yes.
also explain what the biblical meaning for discipline is.
Well, we talked about that last week. You were probably asleep when we came across a section where uh, Solomon talks about using the rod on your children.
Well, this isn't last week, and there may be somebody here who wasn't here last week.
Well, what we said then was that some people try to explain that away and say that Solomon didn't mean to beat your children, but I think in the context of some of the other things he says and the way he uses the rod in other places, I think that's exactly what he meant. And when you look at the time that he was in and the types of punishment that kings passed out, that's probably exactly what he meant. That doesn't mean it's a good thing. That means what Solomon thought was a good thing.
Beating your kid?
Yeah.
Well, I looked it up once. I did a study through the word discipline and found that it meant to govern.
Well, yeah, and wise discipline guides children with the goal of making them self-determining, enabling them to make their own choices, and then honoring and celebrating those choices while at the same time making the young person aware of the pitfalls of foolish choices. And correction takes place when the child considers a foolish choice and the parent offers a perspective on that choice that the young person might not have had the background knowledge to bring to the foreground. And in that case, then, only a fool despises a parent's discipline. Only a fool refuses to say, wait a minute, I didn't know that. Maybe I should rethink my approach to this choice before I make it. Whoever learns from correction is wise. There is treasure in the house of the godly, but the earnings of the wicked bring trouble. The lips of the wise give good advice. The heart of a fool has none to give. This next verse is really interesting in the context of how most people view the temple system of worship that Israel had. The Lord detests the sacrifice of the wicked, but he delights in the prayers of the upright. And I think the lesson we could draw from this verse is that it isn't the form of the worship that matters to God. It is the source and the heart behind that form of worship, behind the worship, that matters to God. So you can go all the way to making a sacrifice, but if your heart isn't right, God isn't impressed that you've gone farther and made a more formal offering of worship, because he looks at the heart, at the motive, at what prompted you to do what you're doing. But a simple prayer from the upright, without any sacrifice or other such religious trappings attached to it, delights God. And I would even say this. Sometimes we're critical of formulaic prayers and published liturgies and so forth because they can become stilted and meaningless because we've said Hail Mary full of grace 100 thousands of times in our lives. We can spit it out without particularly thinking about it. But that doesn't mean that those things are wrong or unacceptable. If they come from a heart that is attached to a brain that needs those crutches to find expression, God looks at the heart, not at the form. So while we might criticize the form for certain failings, that doesn't mean God detests that particular form when somebody uses it from the heart to express genuine devotion to their Creator. The Lord detests the way of the wicked, but he loves those who pursue godliness. And this one, I think, is better worded, because it doesn't say the Lord detests the wicked. It says he detests the way of the wicked. Whoever abandons the right path will be severely disciplined. Whoever hates correction will die. Verse 11, even death and destruction hold no secrets from the Lord. How much more does he know the human heart? Footnote B probably tells us the Hebrew that they're rendering death and destruction there. Let's see what it comes up with. Yes, Sheol and Abaddon. Abaddon is used in the book of Revelation along with the Greek Apollyon, both of which referred to destroyer. So even the grave or the place of the dead and destruction, these things hold no secrets from God. He knew these were, shall we say, functions that would come to life if and when sin entered his universe. So they're not a secret to him. He understands them. He knows what's going on. And if he knows those things, then I think Solomon tried to say to a defendant in his courtroom, how much more does the Creator know what you're thinking and what your motives were in this case that you brought before me? Mockers hate to be corrected, so they stay away from the wise. Interesting.
I said I was incorrect.
All we heard was that you were incorrect. What did you say before that?
Something I said I was incorrect. I said I did a study on discipline, and that was wrong. I did a study on spare the rod and spoil the child, and I looked into rod. Rod was what the king used to govern his land. So when you're sparing the rod from your child, your failure to govern your child is going to spoil your child.
Well, that's one interpretation for that statement. I do think that there are references in the book of Proverbs where he specifies that the rod is for the back. So he's talking about a rod being used to beat somebody.
Okay?
But I'm not saying that means that you should use something to beat your children. I'm saying we have to be careful not to reinterpret what Solomon was saying, because what he's suggesting wouldn't be appropriate in our day. And one of the reasons I think people do that is because they're trying to maintain that doctrine of biblical infallibility. If Solomon said something that we later discovered wasn't true and was inappropriate, well, then all of a sudden the Bible isn't right and everything it says. So we have to go back and re-explain what Solomon said in order to maintain the unerring nature of the written word. But we've pointed out in the past that the reason people want the written word, to be inerrant is so that they can use it as a club to force people into compliance to a particular set of rules. If you're not doing that, then you can live with there being errors in the scripture, because each person is free to interpret the scriptures in a way that meets their needs and supports their relationship with their Creator. And that's what it's there to do. A glad heart makes a happy face. A broken heart crushes the spirit. I wonder if maybe there was a domestic dispute, as we would call it today, brought before Solomon that led him to talk about how a broken heart crushes the spirit.
And you'd be a good one to know about that. How many wives' hearts did he break?
Well, actually, you've got a point. A wise person is hungry for knowledge, while the fool feeds on trash. That sounds pretty colorful and a bit interpretive. Let me see what some other versions do there. We're in chapter 15, verse 14. Well, this is interesting. The NIV says, but the mouth of a fool feeds on folly. And in the King James Version, it reads, but the mouth of fools feedeth on foolishness. The point is that honest people seek truth as a foundation for their living. People who put ideology ahead of reality act like fools and feed on their folly, because anything else crosses their ideology. Well, that can't be true because it doesn't match my ideology. So common sense tells you that's not true. That's kind of how they tend to think and act. For the despondent, every day brings trouble. For the happy heart, life is a continual feast. And this one kind of repeats the general idea behind verse 13. Better to have little with fear for the Lord than to have great treasure and inner turmoil. And don't we find that in our world today, the great majority of people with great treasure also endure inner turmoil because of the lifestyle they have chosen, a lifestyle they chose because they believed it would make them wealthy. And so they didn't choose for inner peace or because this fits my personality. They chose because this will make me really wealthy. And so there's a disconnect between their life and the wealth that they have and the personal satisfaction that they get out of everyday life. Better to have little with fear for the Lord, living according to the Creator's design for life, kingdom living, if you wish, than to have great treasure and inner turmoil. A bowl of vegetables with someone you love is better than steak with someone you hate. Does anybody get the impression that Solomon thought that steak was a better meal than vegetables? Remember, Solomon was not vegetarian. Most Israelites were not vegetarian. In fact, I would challenge you to find an Israelite in Solomon's time that was vegetarian. You probably couldn't find one. There weren't any.
Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego.
Well, that's what they say, but other people have interpreted that as Daniel and his friends couldn't find any flesh food in Babylon that hadn't been offered to idols. And in their minds, that was the barrier. They would not eat that, quotes, contaminated flesh because it had been offered to idols, not because they were specifically vegetarian.
So they were fed a diet of pulp.
Yeah, they ate vegetables and water because the other things did not meet their beliefs and specifications for a proper diet, including not eating meat offered to idols. Now, we know that in the New Testament, Paul said, you know the idol is nothing, so it doesn't matter whether the meat was offered to it. That doesn't change anything. And as long as you have that strong conscience, go ahead and eat. Just don't do it in the presence of a brother with a weak conscience who thinks that's a problem. A hot-tempered person starts fights. A cool-tempered person stops them. I remember when I started teaching, one of the things I told my students is if I find you out there fighting, I don't want to hear about who started it. I want to hear about who stopped it. Because if you start talking about who started, well, then he gets, well, he did, yeah, but before that he did this. Well, yeah, but before that he did this, and so on and so forth. And, go round and round and round. You never get to the beginning. It doesn't matter who started it. What's important is, has somebody got the courage to stop it? Say, no, I'm not taking part in this, and walk away. A hot-tempered person starts fights. A cool-tempered person stops them. A lazy person's way is blocked with briars, but the path of the upright is an open highway. And I get the impression, and in fact I think, well, let me read this in some other versions, because I get the impression I've read something like this, where the implication was that the briars weren't really there, it was just in the imagination of the lazy person. Let's see, that is verse 19. The way of the sluggard is blocked with thorns, but the path of the upright is a highway. I don't really pick it up from that. What does the King James say, just for the fun of it? The way of the slothful man is as an hedge of thorns, but the way of the righteous is made plain. Now, people who don't want to do something are often very creative about coming up with reasons why they didn't do it. Somebody ends up getting arrested on a warrant, and they appear in jail before a judge, and the judge starts reading off all the times that they failed to appear in court on a number of different summons. And their natural reactions want to say, well, yeah, but I had a reason for not showing up in court that day, blah, 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 blah. The judge isn't going to be interested in your excuses. You didn't show up. Now, in a criminal case, they will simply reissue a bench warrant and wait until you get brought in. But the bench warrant does allow the law enforcement officers to forcibly bring you before the judge. In a civil case, it doesn't work like that. If you don't show up to present a defense in a civil case, the judge will issue what's known as a default judgment. You didn't show up and present a defense. We're assuming because of that you didn't have a defense to present. So by default, we're going to grant the plaintiff what they request. This happens quite a bit in landlord-tenant cases, where the landlord will come before the judge and say, so-and-so hasn't paid rent for X number of months. This is how much they owe. If the tenant doesn't show up in court, then the judge will say, well, the tenant's not here. They apparently don't have a defense. Judgment granted for whatever it is the plaintiff asks for. And courts make it specifically difficult to undo a default judgment. In order to get a court to consider reversing a default judgment, you have to come up with two things. The first is a good reason, not just a lame excuse, for why you didn't come to court at the time specified. And two, you have to demonstrate that you have a meritorious defense, that there's a good reason, not just I didn't have the money, that you didn't pay your rent, or whatever else is going on in the case in which the default judgment was entered. Only when you can demonstrate those things will the judge consider reversing the default judgment and holding a hearing on the merits of your case. Sensible children bring joy to their father. Foolish children despise their mother. Foolishness brings joy to those with no sense. A sensible person stays on the right path. And I might suggest that the joy of foolishness is going to be short-lived. Plans go wrong for lack of advice. Many advisors bring success. Did a case come before Solomon where somebody was suing another person because a business venture failed, and as Solomon dug into it, he discovered that the person behind the venture didn't get good advice in how to do it and made poor decisions. So then he says plans go wrong for lack of advice. Many advisors bring success. Everyone enjoys a fitting reply. It is wonderful to say the right thing at the right time. And that might be important simply because just because you're saying the right thing doesn't necessarily mean it's the right time to say that right thing. What's wonderful is when you say that right thing at the right time. The path of life leads upward for the wise. They leave Sheol, I'll bet you, behind. Footnote C. That's what it was, sure enough. The Lord tears down the house of the proud, but he protects the property of the widows. And standard old covenant understanding on that one. The Lord detests evil plans, but he delights in pure words. Notice again, he detests the plans, not the people who make them. Greed brings grief to the whole family. but those who hate bribes will live. And that one makes me wonder if perhaps Solomon had a case brought to him in which he discovered that a previous judge had taken a bribe to make a decision that was not in accordance with justice. And he had to depose that particular judge. And as a result, he said, greed brings grief to the whole family. But those who hate bribes will live. The heart of the godly thinks carefully before speaking. The mouth of the wicked overflows with evil words. I watch a lot of court videos, and a lot of times defendants who haven't got a case otherwise think that somehow by repeating the same idea over and over and over and over and over again, they can get the judge to agree with them. And all they're really doing is opening their mouths and removing all doubt. The mouth of the wicked overflows with evil words. The Lord is far from the wicked, but he hears the prayers of the righteous. Well, actually, according to Jesus, he hears the prayers of the wicked as well. Remember the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. The publican was assumed to be a sinner. The publican assumed he was a sinner. And he came to the temple and he bowed his head and he said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus said that man, rather than the Pharisee who was full of self-congratulation about how good he was, went away from the temple justified. A cheerful look brings joy to the heart. Good news makes for good health. If you listen to constructive criticism, you will be at home among the wise. If you reject discipline, you only harm yourself. But if you listen to correction, you grow in understanding. And of course, we understand that in that setting, it's important that the correction come from somebody we can trust to give good advice. Fear of the Lord teaches wisdom. Humility precedes honor. I get tired of saying it over and over again, but I think we tend to use the wrong word there, and perhaps we do that because the Jewish people have told us that's what that Hebrew word means, so we translate it fear, when in fact we might ought to use a different term, because one of the points we make in this group is that if you fear God, you won't trust him, and if you don't trust him, he cannot transform your character. Only when you trust God can he really transform you and rescue you and heal you and save you from the condition that would otherwise result in eternal death. Humility precedes honor. And remember, humility is not, oh, I'm worse than everybody else. Humility is a recognition that I'm not better than anybody else. It recognizes the fundamental equality of all humans before their Creator. Chapter 16. We can make our own plans, but the Lord gives the right answer. People may be pure in their own eyes, but the Lord examines their motives. And I can imagine a defendant coming before Solomon and honestly and sincerely stating their innocence. And yet Solomon, as he probes the matter, discovers that they are not innocent. And he recognizes that that perception of self-purity is just a perception that's not founded in reality. The Creator knows the motives. He knows when you aren't what you think you are. The Lord has made everything for his own purposes, even the wicked for a day of disaster. Now that takes something that's very true, namely that the Lord, as a creator, makes everything to fit his plan or his purposes. But that does not include him creating wicked people in order to have somebody to bring disaster on. That's not how the Creator works. He didn't create wicked people. He gave the people he created, humans and angels and whatever other species might be out there, he made them with freedom of choice. It is a misuse of that freedom of choice that made people and angels wicked. And the day of disaster is nothing more than a natural result of making foolish choices. The Lord detests the proud, they will surely be punished. Well, we've made the point. He doesn't detest the people, he detests the activities and attitudes and thought patterns that make them proud. But if we as humans can't get past our self-congratulation and our certainty that we're right regardless of any evidence to the contrary, then yes, those people will surely be punished. Not by God, but by reality. Unfailing love and faithfulness make atonement for sin. By fearing the Lord, people avoid evil. In other words, by living as God intended us to live, we can avoid evil. And that includes unfailing love and faithfulness. And we have taught that faithfulness is an element of the Greek word pistis, which in the New Testament is often translated faith. That faith is not just belief, it is also faithfulness to reality. When people's lives please the Lord, even their enemies are at peace with them. Most of the time, anyway. Better to have little with godliness than to be rich and dishonest. And in our day, rich and dishonest seem to go together because rich in our culture and in the way we look at things in the modern age, that the really rich are almost always dishonest, or they would never have gotten that rich.
I think it was the same back then, and the love of money would kind of back me up on that.
You mean Jesus' statement about the love of money being the root of all evil?
Yeah.
Okay. We can make our plans, but the Lord determines our steps. The king speaks with divine wisdom. he must never judge unfairly. Would that modern judges would take that to heart and understand that they have been given by society a position with unique powers, and that is essentially a sacred trust. And to take that lightly or to play with it for either personal gain or to favor a friend is essentially playing with fire. The king must never judge unfairly. The Lord demands accurate scales and balances. He sets the standard for fairness. A king detests wrongdoing, for his rule is built on justice. The king is pleased with words from righteous lips. He loves those who speak honestly. The anger of the king is a deadly threat. The wise will try to appease it. And recall, this is Solomon. And Solomon already has a record of using his personal bodyguard to execute people who have displeased him. So, in that case, the anger of the king was indeed a deadly threat. And then, in the next verse, the contrary, when the king smiles, there is life. His favor refreshes like a spring rain. So we had a group of, 12 through 15. Those verse, we can go back to verse 10. So 10 through 15, essentially 6 verses there, that address the king in his role as the court of last appeal. How much better to get wisdom than gold, and good judgment than silver. There are countless examples in our world today of people who have a good livable income, but live miserably because they're not very good money managers, and other people who don't make as much, but who live a considerably more luxurious life because they are good managers of their spending habits, their money, and so forth. So it is better to get wisdom than gold, and good judgment than silver. The path of the virtuous leads away from evil. Whoever follows that path is safe. Here's a very familiar proverb. Pride goes before destruction, and haughtiness before a fall. Now, very often, that proverb is shortened, and the words destruction and haughtiness before get left out, and people say pride goes before a fall. But the way it actually reads is pride goes before destruction and haughtiness before a fall. There are a lot of things in our culture that get misquoted, and the misquotation becomes what everybody hears and thinks is real, when in fact it's not. And an example, it was one I looked up today, and I sort of remember why. I saw a video where there was a court case determining child support payments for a father, and he didn't know about some of the earliest cases involving his child. When he found out, he showed up, and he showed up in a court that thought he was deceased because his wife had told the court he was deceased. Okay, and that reminded me of a saying attributed to Mark Twain. I'll get that said right in a moment. Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. Well, there was a false obituary published in a New York paper, and in a note to the paper, Twain wrote, the report of my death is an exaggeration. But he did say something else later that led people to come up with the idea that the saying was, reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated.
That happened to Ben Carson.
Did it?
Yeah, he got up one morning and was reading the paper and found its obituary.
Wow.
Or not its obituary, they found a news story about himself.
Did the story say he was dead?
No.
Okay. Better to live humbly with the poor than to share plunder with the proud. Those who listen to instruction will prosper. Those who trust the Lord will be joyful. The wise are known for their understanding, and pleasant words are persuasive. So it's kind of the old saying about you attract more flies with honey than with vinegar. Pleasant words are more persuasive than a vehement argument. Discretion is a life-giving fountain to those who possess it, but discipline is wasted on fools. One wonders if perhaps a defendant showed up more than once in Solomon's court and he'd already issued a punishment for this person's misbehavior. Now they're back in his court with a similar misbehavior. And Solomon concludes that discipline is wasted on fools. From a wise mind comes wise speech. The words of the wise are persuasive. Kind words are like honey, sweet to the soul and healthy for the body. Now, we might take that healthy for the body statement in the context of an agrarian society where people earned their living very literally by the sweat of their brow. And if you're burning a lot of energy, then high-carb foods aren't the problem that they are for people who aren't as active. So, in that case, honey is both sweet to the soul and healthy for the body. There is a path before each person that seems right, but it ends in death. See, we're in chapter 16 now, is it? Yes. There is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. That's another familiar proverb. And you could recognize it even in this more interpretive translation here. So just because a proposed course of action seems right to us doesn't mean it is. That's when it pays to get good advice. Because there might be people who have information we don't that recognize the pitfalls in a proposed course of action. It is good for workers to have an appetite. An empty stomach drives them on. Of course, there are limits to that, because if the stomach gets too energy, the worker won't have the energy to drive on. But, if you're out working hard and lunchtime is arriving, and you know that when you reach a certain point in your labor, you can go eat lunch, that level of empty stomach can in fact drive you on and spur you to get the job done so that you can go to lunch. Yeah, that makes sense. Scoundrels create trouble. Their words are a destructive blaze. A troublemaker plants seeds of strife. Gossip separates the best of friends. Imagine that case. Violent people mislead their companions, leading them down a harmful path. Now, that may be a case where some young person followed the crowd and got into trouble, and this is Solomon's advice. You followed a violent person, and they misled you and led you down a harmful path. With narrowed eyes, people plot evil. With a smirk, they plan their mischief. Gray hair is a crown of glory. It is gained by living a godly life. Better to be patient than powerful. Better to have self-control than to conquer a city. And maybe you'd recognize that one better if I read it out of the King James, where it says, "He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city." We may throw the dice or cast lots, but the Lord determines how they fall. Well, that was a Hebrew approach to things, and there are, I think we've discussed this before, conflicting reports about the function and use of the Urim and Thummim that was given to the priest. We do know that the Bible talks in several places of the people casting lots in an attempt to determine the will of God. Is it possible for God to speak through things like that? Well, I would imagine that it was. I would also imagine that, at least in our day, is not something he's willing to do because of the frequent misuse of chance events. So there are those who say that the Urim and Thummim were like dice, and they were cast in order to determine outcomes and in order to seek the will of God. There are others who make it more mystical and say that they were worn on the shoulders of the priests, one lit up for yes, the other lit up for no. Those are different interpretations of the same thing. But we do know that lot casting was done. Lot casting is how they found Achan and discovered the stolen garments and wedge of gold buried under his tent. So in that case, given the kind of people he was dealing with, God may well have worked through those chance determinations. So we may cast lots, but the Lord determines how they fall. This may be a case where Solomon felt like he had too much conflicting testimony. He couldn't determine the truth, and so he resorted to casting lots in order to make the decision. And in his culture, that would have been seen as an acceptable and believable approach that the litigants would have respected and adhered to. Chapter 17. Better a dry crust eaten in peace than a house filled with feasting and conflict. A wise servant will rule over the master's disgraceful son and will share the inheritance of the master's children. I wonder if there was a case brought to him in which a wayward, quotes, disgraceful son sued to get his share of an inheritance that his father had said should go to a wise servant rather than just the children. And Solomon said, no, you made your dad upset at you. You dishonored him, so he dishonored you and disinherited you. And so the servant deserves to get what his master granted to him in an inheritance, and you don't. Fire tests the purity of silver and gold, but the Lord tests the heart. Now, there are those who will tell you that God intentionally brings trial and trouble in our lives in order to test us. I will agree with that line of thinking to this point, that very often it is trying times, trouble, distress, pressure. These things can reveal the real state of an individual's character. And people without a good, solid foundation of character will break down under pressure. But to say that God does that intentionally is to attribute to him motives I don't think he has. I think life just naturally brings trial and tribulation and trouble into our lives. We don't need anybody to manufacture it. We're going to face plenty of it all on our own. And since we live in a broken world, there are broken people in the world who will sometimes target us and make trouble for us. And those situations may indeed test us like fire tests the purity of silver and gold. But let's not blame that on God. Wrongdoers eagerly listen to gossip. Liars pay close attention to slander. And that's, today we would call that confirmation bias. We tend to hear those things that confirm what we want to believe and not hear those things that go contrary to what we want to believe. So wrongdoers eagerly listen to gossip, and liars pay close attention to slander. Those who mock the poor insult their Maker. Those who rejoice at the misfortune of others will be punished. And I wonder if Solomon would have applied the second line of verse 5 there in other places where he seems to say that people will rejoice when the wicked die. I think there are places where he says something to that effect. We do find things like that in the Psalms at the least. Grandchildren are the crowning glory of the aged. Parents are the pride of their children. And I'll bet you footnote A says fathers. Yes. All right. Eloquent words are not fitting for a fool, even less are lies fitting for a ruler. Maybe there was somebody in a position of authority in Israel that got brought to Solomon and was caught in a lie, and he said, eloquent words aren't fitting for a fool, but in your case, lies are not fitting for you, a ruler, to have on your lips. Oh, wow. A bribe is like a lucky charm. Whoever gives one will prosper. And I'm pretty sure Solomon didn't write this to encourage bribery, because in other places he specifically condemns bribery. So he's saying this a bit pen in check, tongue in cheek, perhaps. A bribe's like a lucky charm. Whoever gives one will prosper. That is, until I get hold of them, and then they're going to find out what reality is all about. Love prospers when a fault is forgiven, but dwelling on it separates close friends. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying about, who started the fight. Well, he did that first. Yeah, but before he did that, I did that. He did this. Well, yeah, but before he did this, I did that. Well, round and round they go. And so, if there's a fault, the best thing to do is to forgive. If you keep dwelling on that fault, you'll separate close friends. A single rebuke does more for a person of understanding than 100 lashes on the back of a fool. Can there be any doubt that with that second line, Solomon is referring to corporal punishment? But he's also telling us perhaps a truth. People who are not amenable to correction are not corrected by making the punishment more severe. That doesn't fix anything. It just adds to the pain and suffering in the world. A person of understanding can be corrected with a single rebuke. They'll see the error of their ways, and they'll correct their practices and make better choices next time around. And you do see people like that show up in court, and they correct themselves, and they never see the judge again, at least not in the courtroom, because they never need to. So a single rebuke, a very light sentence, can do more for a person of understanding than a harsh, even vicious sentence when there's a person who is not receptive to correction. Evil people are eager for rebellion, but they will be severely punished. A king obviously would be very wary of any scent of rebellion amongst his subjects. It is safer to meet a bear robbed of her cubs than to confront a fool caught in foolishness. Now that borrows on a well-known natural phenomenon that mother animals have an instinct to protect their young. And animals with a capability for destructive violence can engage in destructive violence in defense of their young. And Solomon now says, yeah, it's a bad thing to meet a bear robbed of her cubs, but it's even worse if you have to confront a fool caught in foolishness. If you repay good with evil, evil will never leave your house. Starting a quarrel is like opening a floodgate, so stop before a dispute breaks out. Acquitting the guilty and condemning the innocent, both are detestable to the Lord. One wonders if maybe Solomon had a case appealed to him where he determined that the previous judgment involved acquitting the guilty and condemning the innocent. And so he made this statement: both are detestable to the Creator, who knows all things, including the motives of the participants. It is senseless to pay to educate a fool, since he has no heart for learning. A friend is always loyal, and a brother is born to help in time of need. Now, I think that may be something of a reinterpretation of the original wording. That's verse 17. That's not the one I'm thinking of, because in the King James it says, "A friend loveth at all times, and a brother is born for adversity." So that's not what I was thinking. Moving on. It's poor judgment to guarantee another person's debt or put up security for a friend. We ran across a very similar statement earlier. Anyone who loves to quarrel loves sin. Anyone who trusts in high walls invites disaster. And I suppose, since he lived in Jerusalem, a city with high walls, he understood the need for high walls, but he also understood the importance of not trusting in those high walls, because if you do, you might make foolish choices that get you into trouble. The crooked heart will not prosper. The lying tongue tumbles into trouble. It is painful to be the parent of a fool. There is no joy for the father of a rebel. Here's another familiar proverb. A cheerful heart is good medicine, but a broken spirit saps a person's strength. Verse 22, let's read that out of the King James. A merry heart doeth good like a medicine, but a broken spirit drieth the bones. The wicked take secret bribes to pervert the course of justice. Now, when we compare verse 23 here to where's the verse up here earlier, verse 8, we see that verse 8 must certainly be said sarcastically, perhaps, because verse 23 very clearly condemns the taking of bribes. Sensible people keep their eyes glued on wisdom, but a fool's eyes wander to the ends of the earth. Foolish children bring grief to their father, or a foolish son, and bitterness to the one who gave them birth. It is wrong to punish the godly for being good, or to flog leaders for being honest. And I kind of wonder on that one if perhaps a case came to Solomon where a village leader was condemned by a judge and was flogged as a result, even though the leader merely spoke a truth, that the judge didn't want people to hear. So he punished him for saying what was ultimately true. And Solomon's judgment was that that is wrong. You don't punish the godly for being good or flog leaders for being honest. A truly wise person uses few words. A person with understanding is even tempered. Even fools are thought wise when they keep silent. With their mouths shut, they seem intelligent. And that proverb may be the closest to that saying we like to repeat so often here. Better to keep your mouth shut and let everybody think you're stupid than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. This goes at it from a slightly different angle. If you can keep your mouth shut, people might think you're wise. So, yeah, stay quiet if you don't have anything helpful to add to the conversation. Let people think you're smarter than you really are. Now, we have done 3 chapters, and I think the last 2 or 3 weeks, that's been our about how much we get done. And in this case, I'm looking at the clock. We're considerably past 8 o'clock, but we began late. And that's why I decided that we can go ahead and run over a little bit. So now we're about 5 minutes short of our usual time. But rather than starting another chapter out of Proverbs, I think we'll just stop here. Now, I said my mea culpa already for getting involved in something and not getting this started on time this evening. That one was my fault. I take full responsibility. But there was something else that I got to a little late this week. But I did get to it. And this morning, I did finish it. So, we do have a sermon presentation ready to present tomorrow at 11 Central Time, Lord willing. And so that's going to be available, and it'll be live on Facebook. Again, if I don't get caught up in things that get started late, it'll be live on Facebook at 11 Central Time, and you can join us then. And then, of course, we will continue reading through the book of Proverbs next week, Friday evening. The goal, we didn't make it this week, but the goal is 6:30 Central Time, and it is now daylight savings, by the way. And so until then, either tomorrow or next Friday, whenever you choose to join us, we say goodbye and God bless.